this is ideal. Now, at the time, though, I still was struggling with some of these questions. And I didn't give up my Calvinistic convictions. And one of the experiences I had, you probably remember this, was I was invited to a Journey Home Network.
Coming Home Network, yeah, right.
Party, yeah, Coming Home Network, luncheon or dinner. And I sat there with other ministers who, developed an affinity for the show and for people that were on there because I was curious about it. I'd watched the program several times. And Jim Anderson was there, and I saw you come in too. I remember looking over and saying, boy, he's taller than I thought he was. When people meet me, they say, well, boy, he's shorter than I thought he was. And I had a tough question. It was like, well, how do we know that the interpretation of the Scriptures is the right interpretation of the Scriptures? And there was a real Calvinistic answer that I was given at Westminster, and I struggled with that. And it was that the Holy Spirit reveals to the heart of the individual who's elect that this is true. And I did struggle with that.
Pretty subjective.
Because then the next question is, well, why doesn't the Holy Spirit work with larger groups like the Catholic Church to interpret things and to come to proper conclusions? And because the Scriptures essentially said that when Jesus promised his Holy Spirit that would guide the church into all truth. And why is my interpretation the right one and someone else's not the right one?
So you're Presbyterian. Are you, to cut to the chase a little bit here, you didn't just become Catholic, right? You had an Episcopalian time in there, right? Or?
Yes. So when I was still at that stage, and I came to the end of about a couple of years, and I really wanted to go and see if I could serve out some time in the military again. So I went back on active duty, okay, and it was part of my initial phase of development. I thought this would be a great ministry, and maybe if I'm in the Air Force, I won't deploy as much, be away from my family. So I went into the Air Force, and while I was on active duty, the Air Force was a little bit more challenging than the Army was because the chaplains had less people, and they had to come up with services for these less people all together. And there was a sense in which we all had to agree on what these services would look like. So I remember putting together some of these services, and it was like, well, my tradition does this, and your tradition does this, and your tradition does this, and we're putting together all these liturgies. And there was a little dissonance, too, that developed over that, And when you put forth these liturgies, it was almost like we put forth the first Deformed liturgy rather than the first Reformed liturgy. And because it was so... and then that was when I kind of thought back to, well, we had a beautiful liturgy when we used the Book of Common Prayer. Then the war, just the idea of fatigue, and really struggling, with this now. Got back, went to this chaplain recovery retreat where they talked to people who had difficult deployments, and I ran into a friend who was a former PCA, who was now an Anglican priest. And I said, this is the answer. I talked with him, and I said, I really had a rough deployment. I explained some of the things that I'd gone through and thought about, and I said, how's your experience? And he said, it's great. So I talked with his bishop, and they put me through a formation program that lasted about a year and a half. So it was intense. It was study at home, write papers. And I did this while I was on active duty still. Okay. When I started reading and studying Anglican history, I realized that Anglicanism is very charitable in its approach to theology, okay? And even some liturgy, more than I had thought initially. There were people who were way Arminian, there were people who were Calvinist, there were people who were Wesleyan, there were people who were, and I realized that there is some beauty to being charitable and allowing different expressions.
Right.
But then there also is some difficulty in maintaining the whole. How does the center hold? Now, I know from my Westminster days that the church had a way of holding things together, and it was called the magisterium.
Yeah.
And I knew that there was a glaring hole there. But I tried to fall back constantly on, well, the elect know that God spoke to them because he spoke to them, okay? Rather than an objective magisterium that puts together a liturgy and puts together also a theology and says, you know, this is where Christ has led us. So, to make a long story short, when I finished the end of the study course, I thought to myself, I think I'm more Anglo-Catholic. We really need a center. And the way the Anglo-Catholics, which is, it's beautiful how they can hold this with humility many times, is that they still look to Rome and they say that the Pope is the first among equals. You know, maybe there's just an issue of the power, you know, whether the ecclesiology is really fine-tuned or not. And I think along with John Henry Newman, before he was converted, I said, I will adopt this model, and this is kind of how I'll proceed.
Kind of a middle way, as he was trying to find out, right?
A middle way.
Yeah.
Well, it didn't really last that long because I realized that since I was really passionately concerned with some of these issues, magisterium, etc., that I needed to see about the prospects of joining the Catholic Church. And at that point, I started to talk seriously with people and just ask questions. And the question I asked was now from here, I'd moved all the way to Guam. I was on the other side of the earth and in an assignment there. And I asked the Catholic priest to help me. And how he helped me was he hit print button on the New Apostolic Constitution, Anglicanorum Cedibus, written by Benedict XVI, inviting Anglicans into full communion with the Catholic Church who felt God was leading them to do so. Read the Apostolic Constitution and started following the steps. And it was amazing. It really was. At how warm and welcoming the church was when I took the step of faith. There was a little point there where I kind of fell into limbo. Now I'm on active duty. There are not a lot of people going from the Protestant camp to the Catholic camp. So I was kind of going an untread water. An untread path, so to speak. So I filled out the paperwork, and then I was graciously invited to a formation weekend with other people considering coming into the Catholic Church at Houston, Texas, the principal church of the Ordinariate, and I met Monsignor Steenson and other brothers and sisters there, and they welcomed me with open arms. They put me through a rigorous program. It lasted about 1.5 years, and thank God they accepted me, because there was a period there where I didn't know whether I was going to be accepted or not as a priest. And I was ordained a Catholic priest 17 August 2013.
I'm sorry we've run out of time, Father.
I have to say one more thing,
much.
Marcus, quickly.
Yes.
Father Scott, you're awesome, and I love you. You're great. That's all I got.
All right, Father. Thank you very much. And thank you for watching this episode of The Journey Home. I do pray that Father Rojas' journey is an encouragement to you. God bless you, my friend. See you next week.